Six of Crows, Chapter 2. Inej. Kazbrecker didn't need a reason. Those were the words whispered on the streets of Ketterdam, in the taverns and coffee houses, in the dark and bleeding alleys of the pleasure district known as the Barrel. The boy they called Dirty Hands didn't need a reason, any more than he needed permission. To break a leg, sever an alliance, or change a man's fortunes with the turn of a card. Of course, they were wrong, Inej considered as she crossed the bridge over the black waters of the Beers Canal to the deserted main square that fronted the exchange. Every act of violence was deliberate, and every favor came with enough strings attached to stage a puppet show. Kaz always had his reasons. Inej could just never be sure they were good ones, especially tonight. Inej checked her knives, silently reciting their names as she always did when she thought there might be trouble. It was a practical habit, but a comfort, too. The blades were her companions. She liked knowing they were ready for whatever the night might bring. She saw Kaz and the others gathered near the great stone arch that marked the eastern entrance to the exchange. 3 words had been carved into the rock above them: Engine, Vorhent, Alment. Industry, integrity, prosperity. She kept close to the shuttered shop fronts that lined the square, avoiding the pockets of flickering gaslight cast by the street lamps. As she moved, she inventoried the crew Kaz had brought with him: Dietrich, Roddy, Muzzin, and Keeg, Anika and Pim, and his chosen seconds for tonight's party, Jesper and Big Bolliger. They jostled and bumped against each other, laughing, stamping their feet against the cold snap that had surprised the city this week. The last gasp of winter before spring began in earnest. They were all bruisers and brawlers, cold from the younger members of the dregs, the people Kaz trusted most. Inej noted the glint of knives tucked into their belts, lead pipes, weighted chains, axe handles studded with rusty nails, and here and there, the oily gleam of a gun barrel. She slipped silently into their ranks, scanning the shadows near the exchange for signs of black-tip spies. 3 ships, Jesper was saying. The Shoe sent them. They were just sitting in the first harbor, cannons out, red flags flying, stuffed to the sails with gold. Big Bolliger gave a low whistle. Would have liked to see that. Would have liked to steal that, replied Jesper. Half the merchant council was down there flapping and squawking, trying to figure out what to do. Don't they want the Shoe paying their debts? Big Bolliger asked. Kaz shook his head, dark hair glinting in the lamplight. He was a collection of hard lines and tailored edges, sharp jaw, lean build, wool coat snug across his shoulders. Yes and no, he said in his rock-salt rasp. It's always good to have a country in debt to you. Makes for friendlier negotiations. Maybe the Shoe are done being friendly, said Jesper. They didn't have to send all that treasure at once. You think they stuck that trade ambassador? Kaz's eyes found Inej unerringly in the crowd. Ketterdam had been buzzing about the assassination of the ambassador for weeks. It had nearly destroyed Kirch-Zemini relations and sent the merchant council into an uproar. The Zemini blamed the Kirch. The Kirch suspected the Shoe. Kaz didn't care who was responsible. The murder fascinated him because he couldn't figure out how it had been accomplished. In one of the busiest corridors of the Stadhall, in full view of more than a dozen government officials, the Zemini trade ambassador had stepped into a washroom. No one else had entered or left, but when his aide knocked on the door a few minutes later, there had been no answer. When they'd broken down the door, they'd found the ambassador face down on the white tiles, a knife in his back, the tap still running. Kaz had sent Inej to investigate the premises after hours. The washroom had no other entrance, no windows or vents, and even Inej hadn't mastered the art of squeezing herself through the plumbing. Yet, the Zemini ambassador was dead. Kaz hated a puzzle he couldn't solve, and he and Inej had concocted 100 theories to account for the murder, none of which satisfied. But they had more pressing problems tonight. She saw him signal to Jesper and Big Bolliger to divest themselves of weapons. Street law dictated that for a parley of this kind, each lieutenant be seconded by 2 of his foot soldiers, and that they must all be unarmed. Parley. The word felt like a deception, strangely prim and antique. No matter what street law decreed, this night smelled like violence. Go on, give those guns over, Dietrich said to Jesper. With a great sigh, Jesper removed the gun belts at his hips. She had to admit, he looked less himself without them. The The Zemini sharpshooter was long-limbed, brown-skinned, constantly in motion. He pressed his lips to the pearl handles of his prized revolvers, bestowing each with a mournful kiss. "Take good care of my babies," Jesper said as he handed them over to Dirix. "If I see a single scratch or nick on those, I'll spell 'forgive me' on your chest in bullet holes. You wouldn't waste the ammo. And he'd be dead halfway through, forgive," Big Bolliger said as he dropped the hatchet, a switchblade, and his preferred weapon, a thick chain, weighed with a heavy padlock, into Roddy's expectant hands. Jesper rolled his eyes. "It's about sending a message. What's the point of a dead guy with Forg written on his chest?" "Compromise," Kaz said. "I'm sorry he does the trick and uses fewer bullets." Dirix laughed, but Inej noticed that he'd cradled Jesper's revolvers very gently. "What about that?" Jesper asked, gesturing to Kaz's walking stick. Kaz's laugh was low and humorless. "Who'd deny a poor cripple his cane? If the cripple is you, then any man with sense." "Then it's a good thing we're meeting Giels." Kaz drew a watch from his vest pocket. "It's almost midnight." Inej turned her gaze to the exchange. It was a little more than a large rectangular courtyard surrounded by warehouses and shipping offices. But during that day, it was the heart of Ketterdam, bustling with wealthy merchants buying and selling shares in the trade voyages that passed through the city's ports. Now it was nearly 12 bells, and the exchange was deserted but for the guards who patrolled the perimeter and the rooftop. They'd been bribed to look the other way during tonight's parley. The exchange was one of the few remaining parts of the city that hadn't been divvied up and claimed in the ceaseless skirmishes between Ketterdam's rival gangs. It was supposed to be neutral territory, but it didn't feel neutral to Inej. It felt like the hush of the woods before the snare yanks tight and the rabbit starts to scream. It felt like a trap. "This is a mistake," she said. Big Bolliger started. He hadn't known she was standing there. Inej heard the name the dregs preferred for her whispered among the ranks. The Wraith. "Giels is up to something." "Of course he is," said Kaz. His voice had the rough, abraded texture of stone against stone. Inej always wondered if he'd sounded that way as a little boy, if he'd ever been a little boy. "Then why come here tonight?" "Because this is the way Per Haskell wants it." Old man, old ways, Inej thought but didn't say, as she suspected the other dregs were thinking the same thing. "He's gonna get us all killed," she said. Jesper stretched his long arms overhead and grinned, his teeth white against his dark skin. He had yet to give up his rifle, and the silhouette of it across his back made him resemble a gawky, long-limbed bird. "Statistically, he'll probably only get some of us killed." "It was not something to joke about," she replied. The look Kaz cast her was amused. She knew how she sounded. Stern, fussy, like an old crone making dire pronouncements from her porch. She didn't like it, but she also knew she was right. Besides, old women must know something, or they wouldn't live to gather wrinkles and yell from their front steps. "Jesper isn't making a joke," Inej said Kaz. "He's figuring the odds." Big Bolliger cracked his huge knuckles. "Well, I've got a logger and a skillet of eggs waiting for me at the Cooperam, so I can't be the one to die tonight." "Care to place a wager?" Jesper asked. "I'm not going to bet on my own death." Kaz flipped his hat onto his head and ran his gloved finger along the brim in a quick salute. "Why not, Bolliger? We do it every day." He was right. Inej's debt to Per Haskell meant she gambled her life for every time she took on a new job or assignment, every time she left her room at the Slat. Tonight was no different. Kaz struck his walking stick against the cobblestones as the bells from the church of Barter began to chime. The group fell silent. The time for talk was done. "Giels isn't smart, but he's just bright enough to be trouble," said Kaz. "No matter what you hear, you don't join the fray unless I give the command. Stay sharp." Then he gave Inej a brief nod, and stay hidden. "No mourners," Jesper said as he tossed his rifle to Roddy. "No funerals." The rest of the dregs murmured in reply. Among them, it passed for good luck. Before Inej could melt into the shadows, Kaz tapped her arm with his crow's head cane. "Keep a watch on the rooftop guards. Giels may have them in his pocket." Then, Inej began, but Kaz was already gone. Inej threw up her hands in frustration. She had 100 questions, but as usual, Kaz was keeping a stranglehold on the answers. She jogged towards the canal, facing wall of the exchange. Only the lieutenants and their seconds were allowed to enter during the parley. But just in case the Black Tips got any ideas, the other dregs would be waiting right outside the eastern arch with weapons at the ready. She knew Gilles would have his crew of heavily armed Black Tips gathered at the western entrance. Inej would find her own way in. The rules of fair play among the gangs were from Per Haskell's time. Besides, she was the Wraith. The only law that applied to her was gravity, and some days she defied that too. The lower level of the exchange was dedicated to windowless warehouses, so Inej located a drain pipe to shin up. Something made her hesitate before she wrapped her hand around it. She drew a bone light from her pocket and gave it a shake, casting a pale green glow over the pipe. It was slick with oil. She followed the wall, seeking another option, and found a stone cornice bearing a statue of Kirch's 3 flying fishes within reach. She stood on her toes and tentatively felt along the top of the cornice. It had been covered in ground glass. "I'm expected," she thought with grim pleasure. She'd joined up with the dregs less than 2 years ago, just days after her 15th birthday. It had been a matter of survival, but it gratified her to know that, in such short time, she'd become someone to take precautions against. Though, if the Black Tips thought tricks like this would keep the Wraith from her goal, they were sadly mistaken. She drew 2 climbing spikes from the pockets of her quilted vest and wedged first one, then the other, between the bricks of the wall as she hoisted herself higher, her questioning feet finding the smallest holes and ridges in the stone. As a child learning the high wire, she'd gone barefoot, but the streets of Ketterdam were too cold and wet for that. After a few bad spills, she'd paid a Grisha fabricator working in secret out of a gin shop on the Windstraat to make her a pair of leather slippers with nubby rubber soles. They were perfectly fitted to her feet and gripped any surface with surety. On the 2nd story of the exchange, she hoisted herself onto the window ledge just wide enough to perch on. Kaz had done his best to teach her, but she didn't quite have his way with breaking and entering, and it took a few tries to finesse the lock. Finally, she heard a satisfying click, and the window swung open in a deserted office, its walls covered in maps marked with trade routes, and chalkboards listing share prices in the name of ships. She ducked inside, refastened the latch, and picked her way past the empty desks with their neat stacks of orders and tallies. She crossed to a slender set of doors and stepped onto a balcony that overlooked the central courtyard of the exchange. Each of the shipping offices had one. From here, callers announced new voyages and arrivals of inventory, or hung the black flag that indicated that a ship had been lost at sea with all its cargo. The floor of the exchange would erupt in a flurry of trades. Runners would spread the word through the city, and the price of goods, futures, and shares in outgoing voyages would rise or fall. But tonight, all was silence. A wind came in off the harbor, bringing the smell of the sea, ruffling the stray hairs that escaped the braided coil at the nape of Inej's neck. Down in the square, she saw the sway of lamplight and heard the thump of Kaz's cane on the stones as he and his seconds made their way across the square. On the opposite side, she glimpsed another set of lanterns heading towards them. The Black Tips had arrived. Inej raised her hood. She pulled herself onto the railing and leaped soundlessly onto the neighboring balcony, then the next, tracking Kaz and the others around the square, staying as close as she could. His dark coat rippled in the salt breeze, his limp more pronounced tonight, as it always was when the weather turned cold. She could hear Jesper keeping a lively stream of conversation and Big Bolliger's low, rumbling chuckle. As she drew nearer to the other side of the square, Inej saw that Gilles had chosen to bring Elzinger and Uman, exactly as she had predicted. Inej knew the strengths and weaknesses of every member on the Black Tips, not to mention Harley's Pointers, the Liddies, the Razor Gulls, the Dime Lions, and every other gang working the streets of Ketterdam. It was her job to know that Gilles trusted Elzinger because they'd come up through the ranks of the Black Tips together, and because Elzinger was built like a stack of boulders, nearly 7 feet tall, dense with muscle, his wide, mashed-in face jammed low on his neck, thick as a pylon. She was suddenly glad Big Bolliger was with Kaz. That Kaz had chosen Jesper to be one of his seconds was no surprise. Twitchy as Jesper was, with or without his revolvers, he was at his best in a fight, and she knew he'd do anything for Kaz. He'd been less sure when Kaz had insisted on Big Bolliger as well. Big Ball was a bouncer at the Crow Club, perfectly suited to tossing out drunks and wasters, but too heavy on his feet to be much use when it came to a real tussle. Still, at least he was tall enough to look Elzinger in the eye. Inej didn't want to think too much on Gil's other second. Umen made her nervous. He wasn't as physically intimidating as Elzinger. In fact, Umen was made like a scarecrow. Not scrawny, but as if beneath his clothes, his body had been put together at wrong angles. Word was he'd once crushed a man's skull with his bare hands, wiped his palms clean on his shirt front, and kept right on drinking. Inej tried to quiet the unease rolling through her, and listened as Gilles and Kaz made small talk in the square while their seconds patted each of them down to make sure no one was carrying. "Naughty," Jesper said as he removed a tiny knife from Elzinger's sleeve and tossed it across the square. "Clear," declared Big Bolliger as he finished patting down Gilles and moved on to Umen. Kaz and Gilles discussed the weather, the suspicion that the Cooperum was serving watered-down drinks, now that the rent has been raised, dancing around the real reason they'd come here tonight. In theory, they would chat, make their apologies, agree to respect the boundaries of the Fifth Harbor, then all head out to find a drink together. At least, that's what Per Haskell had insisted. But what does Per Haskell know? Inej thought as she looked for the guards patrolling the roof above, trying to pick out the shapes in the dark. Haskell ran the dregs, but these days he preferred to sit in the warmth of his room, drinking lukewarm lager, building model ships, and telling long stories of his exploits to anyone who would listen. He seemed to think that territory wars could be settled as they once had been, with a short scuffle and a friendly handshake. But every one of Inej's senses told her that this was not how this was going to play out. Her father would have said that the shadows were about their own business tonight. Something bad was going to happen here. Kaz stood with both gloved hands resting on the carved crow's head of his cane. He looked totally at ease, his narrow face obscured by the brim of his hat. Most gang members in the barrel loved flash, gaudy waistcoats, watch fobs studded with false gems, trousers in every print and pattern imaginable. Kaz was the exception, the picture of restraint, his dark vests and trousers simply cut and tailored along severe lines. At first, she'd thought it was a matter of taste, but she'd come to understand that it was a joke he played on the upstanding merchers. He enjoyed looking like one of them. "I'm a businessman," he told her, "no more, no less." "You're a thief, Kaz. Isn't that what I just said?" Now he looked like some sort of priest come to preach to a group of circus performers. A young priest, she thought with another pang of unease. Kaz had called Gilles old and washed up, but he certainly didn't seem that way tonight. The Black Tips lieutenant might have wrinkles creasing the corners of his eyes and burgeoning jowls beneath his sideburns, but he looked confident, experienced. Next to him, Kaz looked, 17. "Let's be fair, Ja. All we want is a bit more scrub," Gilles said, tapping the mirrored buttons of his lime green waistcoat. "It's not fair for you to coal every spend-happy tourist stepping off a pleasure boat at Fifth Harbor." "Fifth Harbor is ours, Gilles," Kaz replied. "The dregs got first crack at the pigeons who come looking for a little fun." Gilles shook his head. "You're a young one, Brecker," he said, with an indulgent laugh. "Maybe you don't understand how these things work. The harbors belong to the city, and we have as much right to them as anyone. We all got a living to make." Technically, this was true. But Fifth Harbor had been useless and all but abandoned by the city when Kaz had taken it over. He'd had it dredged, and then built out the docks and the quarry, and he'd even had to mortgage the Crow Club to do it. Per Haskell had railed at him and called him a fool for the expense, but eventually he'd relented. According to Kaz, the old man's exact words had been, "Take all that rope and hang yourself." But the endeavor had paid for itself in less than a year. Now, Fifth Harbor offered birth to merchant ships, as well as boats from all over the world carrying tourists and soldiers eager to see the sights and sample the pleasures of Ketterdam. The dregs got first try at all of them, steering them and their wallets into brothels, taverns, and gambling dens owned by the gang. Fifth Harbor had made the old man very rich and cemented the dregs as real players in the barrel in a way that not even the success of the Crow Club had. But with profit came unwanted attention. Geels and black tips had been making trouble for the dregs all year, encroaching on Fifth Harbor, picking off pigeons that weren't rightfully theirs. Fifth Harbor is ours, Kaz repeated. It isn't up for negotiation. You're cutting into our traffic from the docks, and you intercepted a shipment of Jurda that should have docked 2 nights ago. Don't know what you're talking about. I know it comes easy, Geels, but try not to play dumb with me. Geels took a step forwards. Jesper and Big Bolliger tensed. Quit flexing, boy, Geels said. We all know that the old man doesn't have the stomach for a real brawl. Kaz's laugh was dry as the rustle of dead leaves. But I'm the one at your table, Geels, and I'm not here for a taste. You want a war? I'll make sure you eat your fill. And what if you're not around, Brecker? Everyone knows you're the spine of Haskell's operation. Snap it, and the dregs collapse. Jesper snorted. Stomach, spine, what's next, spleen? Shut it, Ooman snarled. The rules of parley dictated that only the lieutenants could speak once negotiations had begun. Jesper mouthed, sorry, and elaborately pantomimed locking his lips shut. I'm fairly sure you're threatening me, Geels, Kaz said, but I want to be certain before I decide what to do about it. Sure of yourself, aren't you, Brecker? Myself and nothing else. Geels burst out laughing and elbowed Ooman. Listen to this cocky little piece of crap. Brecker, you don't own these streets. Kids like you are fleas. A new crop of you turns up every few years to annoy your betters until a big dog decides to scratch. And let me tell you, I'm about tired of the itch. He crossed his arms, pleasure rolling off him in smug waves. What if I told you there are 2 guards with city-issue rifles pointed at you and your boys right now? Inesh's stomach dropped. Was that what Kaz had meant when he said Geels might have the guards in his pocket? Kaz glanced up at the roof. Hiring city guards to do your killing. I'd say that's an expensive proposition for a gang like the Black Tips. I'm not sure I believe your coffers could support it. Inej climbed onto the railing and launched herself from the safety of the balcony, heading for the roof. If they survived the night, she was going to kill Kaz. There was always 2 guards from the Stadwatch posted on the roof of the exchange. A few crudge from the dregs and the Black Tips had ensured they wouldn't interfere with the parley, a common enough transaction. But Geels was implying something very different. Had he really managed to bribe city guards to play sniper for him? If so, the dregs' odds of surviving this night had just dwindled to a knife's point. Like most of the buildings in Ketterdam, the exchange had a sharply gabled roof to keep off heavy rain, so the guards patrolled the rooftop via a narrow walkway that overlooked the courtyard. Inej ignored it. It was easier going but would have left her too exposed. Instead, she scaled halfway up the slick roof tiles and started crawling, her body tilted at a precarious angle, moving like a spider as she kept one eye on the guard's walkway and one ear on the conversation below. Maybe Geels was bluffing, or maybe the 2 guards were hunched over the railing right now with Kaz or Jesper or Big Bolliger in their sights. Took some doing, Geels admitted. We're a small operation right now, and city guards don't come cheap, but it'll be worth it for the prize. That being me, that being you. I'm flattered. The dregs won't last a week without you. I'd give them a month on sheer momentum. The thought rattled noisily around Inej's head. If Kaz was gone, would I stay, or would I skip out on my debt? Take my chances with Per Haskell's enforcers. If she didn't move faster, she might well find out. Smug little slum rat, Geels laughed. I can't wait to wipe that look off of your face. So do it, Kaz said. Inej risked a look down. His voice had changed, all humor gone. Should I have them put a bullet in your good leg, Brecker? Where are the guards? Inej thought, picking up her pace. She raced across the steep pitch of the gable. The exchange stretched nearly the length of a city block. There was too much territory to cover. "Stop talking, Giles. Tell them to shoot." "Kaz," said Jasper nervously. "Go on, find your balls and give the order." What game was Kaz playing? Had he expected this? Had he just assumed Inej would find her way to the guards in time? She glanced down again. Giles radiated anticipation. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. Inej's steps faltered, and she had to fight not to go sliding straight off the edge of the roof. "He's going to do it. I'm going to watch Kaz die." "Fire," Giles shouted. A gunshot split the air. Big Bolliger let loose a cry and crumpled to the ground. "Damn it," shouted Jasper, dropping to one knee beside Bolliger and pressing his hand to the bullet wound as the big man moaned. "You worthless podge," he yelled at Giles. "You just violated neutral territory." "Nothing to say you didn't shoot first," Giles replied. "And who's going to know? None of you are walking out of here." Giles's voice sounded too high. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Inej could hear panic pulsing against his words, the startled wing beat of a frightened bird. Why? Moments before he'd been all bluster. That was when Inej saw Kaz still hadn't moved. "You don't look well, Giles." "I'm just fine," he said, but he wasn't. He looked pale and shaky, his eyes were darting right and left as if searching for the shadowed walkway of the roof. "Are you?" Kaz said conversationally. "Things aren't going quite as planned, aren't they?" "Kaz," Jesper said. "Bolliger's bleeding bad." "Good," Kaz said, ignoring him. "Kaz, he needs a medkit." Kaz spared the wounded man the barest glance. "What he needs to do is stop bellyaching and be glad I didn't have Holst take him down with a headshot." Even from above, Inej saw Giles flinch. "That's the guard's name, isn't it?" Kaz asked. "William Holst and Bert Van Dahl. The 2 city guards on duty tonight. The ones you emptied the Black Tip's coffers to bribe." Giles said nothing. "Willem Host," Kaz said loudly, his voice floating to the roof. "Likes to gamble almost as much as Jesper does, so your money held a lot of appeal. But Holst has much bigger problems. Let's call them urges. I won't go into detail. A secret's not like a coin. It doesn't keep its value in the spending. You'll just have to trust me when I say this one would turn even your stomach. Isn't that right, Holst?" The response was another gunshot. It struck the cobblestone near Giles's feet. Giles released a shocked bleat and sprang back. This time, Inej had a better chance to track the origin of the gunfire. The shot had come somewhere from the west side of the building. If Holst was there, that meant the other guard, Bert Van Dahl, would be on the east side. Had Kaz managed to neutralize him too? Or was he counting on her? She sped over the gables. "Just shoot him, Holst," Giles bellowed, desperation sawing at his voice. "Shoot him in the head." Kaz snorted in disgust. "Do you really think that secret would die with me?" "Go on, Holst," he called. "Put a bullet in my skull. There will be messengers sprinting to your wife and your watch captain's door before I hit the ground." No shot came. "How?" Giles said bitterly. "How did you even know who would be on duty tonight? I had to pay through the gills to get that roster. You couldn't have outbid me. Let's say my currency carries more sway. Money is money. I trade in information, Giles. The things men do when they think no one is looking. Shame holds more value than coin ever can." He was grandstanding. Inej saw that, buying her time as she leapt over the slate shingles. "Are you worrying about the second guard? Good old Bert Van Dahl?" Kaz asked. "Maybe he's up there right now, wondering what he should do. Shoot me? Shoot Holst? Or maybe I got to him too, and he's getting ready to blow a hole in your chest, Giles." He leaned in as if he and Giles were sharing a great secret. "Why not give Van Dahl the other order and find out?" Giles opened and closed his mouth like a carp, then bellowed, "Van Dahl!" Just as Van Dahl parted his lips to answer, Inej slipped up behind him and placed a blade to his throat. She'd barely had time to pick out his shadow and slide down the roof tiles. Saints, Kaz liked to cut it close. "Shh," she whispered in Van Dahl's ear. She gave him a tiny jab in the side so he could feel the point of her second dagger pressed against his kidney. Please, he moaned. I like it when men beg, she said, but this isn't the time for that. Below, she could see Gil's chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. Von Dahl, he shouted again. There was rage in his face when he turned back to Kaz. Always one step ahead, aren't you? Gils, when it comes to you, I'd say I have a running start. But Gils just smiled, a tiny smile, tight and satisfied, a victor's smile. Inej released with fresh fear. The race isn't over yet. Gils reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy black pistol. Finally, Kaz said, the big reveal. Now Jesper can stop kneeling over Bolliger like a wet-eyed woman. Jesper stared at the gun with stunned, furious eyes. Bolliger searched him. Oh, big ball, you idiot, he groaned. Inej couldn't believe what she was seeing. The guard in her arms released a tiny squeak. In her anger and surprise, she'd accidentally tightened her grip. Relax, she said, easing her hold, but all saints, she wanted to put a knife through something. Big Bolliger had been the one to pat down Gils. There was no way he could have missed the pistol. He'd betrayed them. Was that why Kaz had insisted on bringing Big Bolliger here tonight? So he'd have a public confirmation that Bolliger had gone over to the Black Tips? It was certainly why he'd let Holst put a bullet in Bolliger's gut. But so what? Now everyone knew Big Bull was a traitor. Kaz still had a gun pointed at his chest. Gils smirked. Kaz Brecker, the great escape artist. How are you going to wriggle your way out of this one? Going out the same way I came in, Kaz ignored the pistol, turning his attention to the big man lying on the ground. Do you know what your problem is, Bolliger? He jabbed the wound in Big Bull's stomach with the tip of his cane. That wasn't a rhetorical question. Do you know what your biggest problem is? Bolliger mewled. No. Give me a guess, Kaz hissed. Big Bull said nothing, just released another trembling whisper. All right, I'll tell you. You're lazy. I know it. Everyone knows it. So I had to ask myself why my laziest bouncer was getting up early twice a week to walk 2 extra miles to Celia's Fry for breakfast, especially when the eggs are so much better at the Cooperam. Big Bull becomes an early riser, the Black Tips start throwing their weight around Fifth Harbor, and then intercept our biggest shipment of Jurda. It wasn't a tough connection to make. He sighed and said to Gils, This is what happens when stupid people make big plans, Ja. Doesn't matter much now, does it? Replied Gils. This gets ugly, I'm shooting from close range. Maybe your guards get me, or my guys, but no way you're going to dodge this bullet. Kaz stepped into the barrel of the gun so that it was pressed directly against his chest. No way at all, Gils. You think I won't do it? Oh, I think you'd do it gladly, with song in your black heart. But you won't. Not tonight. Gil's finger twitched on the trigger. Kaz, Jesper said, this whole shoot me thing is starting to concern me. Uman didn't bother to object to Jesper mouthing off this time. One man was down. Neutral territory had been violated. The sharp tang of gunpowder already hung in the air, and along with it a question, unspoken in the quiet, as if the Reaper himself awaited the answer. How much blood will be shed tonight? In the distance, a siren wailed. 19 Björstrat, Kaz said. Gils had been shifting slightly from foot to foot. Now he went very still. That's your girl's address, isn't it, Gils? Gils swallowed. Don't have a girl. Oh yes, you do, crooned Kaz. She's pretty too. Well, pretty enough for a fink like you. Seems sweet. You love her, don't you? Even from the rooftop, Inej could see the sheen of sweat on Gil's waxen face. Of course you do. No one that fine should ever have looked twice at a barrel scum like you. But she's different. She finds you charming. Sure sign of madness if you ask me. But love is strange that way. Does she like to rest her pretty head on your shoulder? Listen to you talk about your day? Gils looked at Kaz if he was finally starting to see him for the first time. The boy he'd been talking to had been cocky, reckless, easily amused, but not frightening. Not really. Now, the monster was here, dead-eyed and unafraid. Kaz Brecker was gone, and Dirty Hands had come to see the rough work done. "She lives at 19 Bierstraat," Kaz said in his gravelly rasp, "3 floors up. Geraniums in the window boxes. There are 2 dregs waiting outside her door right now, and if I don't walk out of here whole and feeling righteous, they will set that place alight from floor to rooftop. It will go up in seconds, burning from both ends with poor Elise trapped in the middle. Her blonde hair will catch first, like the wick of a candle." "You're bluffing," said Giels, but his pistol hand was trembling. Kaz lifted his head and inhaled deeply. "Getting late now. You heard the siren. I smell the harbor in the wind, sea and salt, and maybe, is that smoke I smell too?" There was pleasure in his voice. "Oh, saints, Kaz," Inej thought miserably. "What have you done now?" Again, Giels' finger twitched on the trigger, and Inej tensed. "I know, Giels, I know," Kaz said sympathetically. "All that planning and scheming and bribing for nothing. That's just what you're thinking right now. That's what you're thinking right now. How bad will it feel to walk home knowing you've lost? How bad will it feel to walk home knowing what you've lost? How angry your boss is going to be when you show up empty-handed and that much poorer for it? How satisfying would it be to put a bullet in my heart? You can do it. Pull the trigger. We can all go down together. They can take our bodies out of the Reaper's barge for burning, like all paupers go. Or you can take the blow to your pride, go back to Bierstraat, lay your head in your girl's lap, and fall asleep still breathing, and dream of revenge. It's up to you, Giels. Do we get to go home tonight?" Giels searched Kaz's gaze, and whatever he saw there made his shoulders sag. Inej was surprised to feel a pang of pity for him. He'd walked to this place buoyed on bravado, a survivor, a champion of the barrel. He'd leave as another victim of Kaz Brecker. "You'll get what's coming to you someday, Brecker." "I will," said Kaz, "if there's any justice in this world, and we all know how likely that is." Giels let his arm drop. The pistol hung uselessly by his side. Kaz stepped back, brushing the front of his shirt where the gun barrel rested. "Go and tell your general to keep the black tips out of Fifth Harbor, and that we expect him to make amends for the shipment of Jurda we lost, plus 5% for drawing steel on neutral ground, and 5% more for being such a spectacular bunch of asses." Then Kaz's cane swung in a sudden sharp arc. Giels screamed as his wrist bones shattered. The gun clattered to the paving stones. "I stood down," cried Giels, cradling his hand. "I stood down. You draw on me again, I'll break both your wrists, and you'll have to hire someone to help you take a piss." Kaz tipped the brim of his hat up with the head of his crane. "Or maybe you can get the lovely Elise to do it for you." Kaz crouched down beside Bolliger. The big man whimpered. "Look at me, Bolliger. Assuming you don't bleed to death tonight, you'll have until sunset tomorrow to get out of Ketterdam. I hear you're anywhere near the city limits, and they'll find you stuffed in a keg at Celia's Fry." Then he looked at Giels. "You'll help Bolliger, or I'll find out he's running with the black tips. Don't think I won't come after you." "Please, Kaz," moaned Bolliger. "You had a home, and you put a wrecking ball through the front door, Bolliger. Don't look for sympathy with me." He rose and checked his pocket watch. "I didn't expect this to go on so long. I'd best be on my way, or poor Elise will be getting a trifle warm." Giels shook his head. "There's something wrong with you, Brecker. I don't know what you are, but you're not made right." Kaz cocked his head to one side. "You're from the suburbs, aren't you, Giels? Came to the city to try your luck?" He smoothed his lapel with one gloved hand. "Well, I'm the kind of bastard they only manufacture in the barrel." Despite the loaded gun at the black tip's feet, Kaz turned his back on them and limped across the cobblestones toward the eastern arch. Jesper squatted down next to Bolliger and gave him a gentle pat on the cheek. "Idiot," he said sadly, and followed Kaz out of the exchange. From the roof, Inej continued to watch as Uman picked up and holstered Giels' gun, and the black tips said a few quiet words to each other. "Don't leave," Big Bolliger begged. Don't leave me." He tried to cling to the cuff of Gilles' trousers. Gilles shook him off. They left him curled on his side, leaking blood onto the cobblestones. Inej plucked Von Dahl's rifle from his hands before she released him. "Go home," she told the guard. He cast a single terrified glance over his shoulder and sprinted off down the walkway. Far below, Big Ball had started trying to drag himself across the floor of the exchange. He might be stupid enough to cross Kaz Brecker, but he'd survived this long in the barrel, and that took will. He might make it. "Help him," a voice inside her said. Until a few moments ago, he'd been her brother in arms. It seemed wrong to leave him alone. She could go to him, offer to put him out of his misery quickly, hold his hand as he passed. She could fetch a medkit to save him. Instead, she spoke a quick prayer in the language of her saints and began the steep climb down the outer wall. Inej pitied the boy who might die alone with no one to comfort him in his last hours, or who might live and spend his life as exile. But the night's work wasn't yet over, and the Wraith didn't have time for traitors.